live. So hello to everyone who's live with us as well. We will put out Scotty's email address. I guess that's all right, right?
Yeah.
We'll put out Scotty's email address afterwards for questions and follow-up. But it's really our honor. Scott came out here to be in warm weather for a week and to spend time with us. And of course,
to me, it's warm coming from the East Coast.
And I had the bright idea. Well, if you're coming out already, let's do something. You may remember a few years ago at Temple Isaiah, we did an evening with Scotty on the fate of those who were on the St. Louis, what was called the Voyage of the Damned in the movie, and there was a book. And the truth is, I wanted him to talk tonight about blues on the St. Louis. That's a joke. No, there was no blues, and I probably shouldn't joke about those things. But
no, well, there was a band. They thought they were going to Freedom. There were dances and on the way over, not on the way back.
Right. And you may remember from that lecture that it was a little bit surprising because most of the people did not die in the Holocaust that were on that ship. And Scotty and his colleague at the United States Holocaust Museum did some really serious research and produced a wonderful book called Refuge Denied. And you can get that book on Amazon. It's a really good read. It's like a detective novel about history. So, but that's not what Scott is here to talk about. He is a Holocaust scholar. He was at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. for many years. In fact, from before it was even built. He was on the original team and was part of it for 30 years?
30, yes.
30 years and retired. And since he's retired, it doesn't look like he's retired to me. When I think retired, I think of something else. He seems to be working pretty hard, even in the last few days, working on a project in Portland, Oregon, about Chana Senesh?
No, and it's actually about human rights and genocide after the Holocaust.
Okay. Scotty's expertise is having to do with artifacts from the Holocaust, from places you don't usually think of, like Morocco. And just a wonderful, wonderful person and extremely humble and modest, something he obviously does not get from his friend, the rabbi in Palm Springs. So we welcome Scott to be with us and to give us a presentation on somebody who, if you ever spent any time in Israel, you might know this name. If you didn't, maybe you didn't know this name until now. Chana Senesh, a real heroic figure. Thank you, Scotty.
Okay. Sorry. So you can all hear me? Okay, that's great. Thank you for inviting me, Rabbi Lazar. Thank you, Madalena, for all the technical assistance, and thank you all for coming. So I'm going to sort of start at the end of the story being 2009, and then go back in time a little. One day in 2009, I got a phone call at work, perhaps the most exciting phone call I ever got, and I got a lot of exciting phone calls from people all over the world with amazing stories to share and artifacts to share for the collection at the Holocaust Museum. But this was a really special call, and it was from Israel, and the guy got on the phone and said, hello, my name is Eitan Senesh. My aunt was Chana Senesh. And I really couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was shocked and stunned in a good way. And now I'm going to go back in time to tell you the story of Chana Senesh, so it will help you understand why I say it was the most exciting call. And then we'll go back to 2009, and I'll tell you why he was calling me. That's another story. That's the behind-the-scenes part. But more important than me is Chana Senesh. So Chana Senesh was born on July 17th, 1921 in Budapest, Hungary, to a very, very assimilated Hungarian Jewish family. Her father, Bela Senesh, was a very well-known playwright, although he died when Chana was around 6 years old. And Chana's mother sent her and actually her brother to a Christian high school. Not because it was Christian, because it happened to be the best private school in the city. It was a Protestant high school, and if Jews or Catholics wanted to study there, they actually had to pay extra to study there. But the Senesh family was relatively well off, and they paid for Chana's education. And it was there that Chana really first experienced anti-Semitism. And this is not unusual, that propelled her to look more into her Jewish roots, of which she knew very little. And it also propelled her to become a Zionist. And she joined a Zionist youth movement called Maccabiah in Budapest. And lo and behold, in 1939, when she was only 18 years old, she decided she didn't want to stay in Budapest and moved to what was then Israel, called Palestine, or the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement in Palestine. You could imagine how shocked her mother was. And by the way, this is a picture of Hannah. She was like 17 or 18 in Budapest. You could see they relatively, comfortable life materialistically. Her mother was totally shocked that she wanted to move to Palestine. She says, what's there? It's a warring, swamp-ridden country. And Hannah insisted, and she did it by herself. She didn't know any Hebrew. She began in Budapest to try to study Hebrew and teach herself Hebrew. And she also began in Budapest to keep a diary, which she continued with in Palestine. And the next slide, please. Hannah went to study agriculture, which probably was her mother's just worst nightmare. And here she is. It's at an agricultural school for girls up in the north near the Moshav Nahalal. Maybe some of you heard of it. That's where Moshe Dayan grew up. And there's Hannah, the city girl from Budapest, with the chickens. And she you can go to the next slide. She studied there for 2 years, and then went to live on a kibbutz called Sdot Yam, which is sort of like between Caesarea or Caesarea and Haifa, along the water. And if you've been to kibbutz lately, they're quite lush and lovely looking. It wasn't that way in the 1930s. This was near Sdot Yam, and Hannah's in the photo with her group, called her Garin, her sort of seed organization of fellow young settlers. And people asked, why did she choose Sdot Yam? And she always said, it's because it's not one of the Hungarian kibbutzim. A lot of the young Hungarian pioneers sort of stuck together and founded their own kibbutzim. She really wanted to acculturate into life in Palestine, and she wanted to force herself to learn Hebrew. So she chose one that was not actually popular with the Hungarians. And you could get a sense that Hannah was sort of like a very determined, sort of stubborn, individual. And though she learned agriculture her first 2 years in Palestine, when she went to live on Sdot Yam, she was actually put in the laundry. So it wasn't quite as romantic as working in the fields as she thought. And she kept a diary. And in that diary, she talked about, is she really contributing to the society by working in the laundry? But she probably is. Everyone needs a laundry. You could see just sort of a lot of sort of inner struggle. But what Hannah did in her spare time, she began to write. Maybe there was writing in her genes, in her blood. Her father was a very well-known Hungarian writer. So in the next slide is a draft of something she wrote one day, literally while walking along the beach in Caesarea. And I don't know if I can't sing, but I'm sort of jumping ahead, but this poem that she wrote, and this is the very first draft of it, called Halikhala Caesarea, or more popularly known as Eli Eli, became one of the most perhaps famous Jewish songs. And you can sing it or play it, or
Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, hachol v'hayam, v'yitru shel hamayim, barak hashamayim, tfilat ha'adam, hachol v'hayam, v'yitru shel hamayim, barak hashamayim, tfilat ha'adam.
have any of you heard that? Yes, good. So anyway, so what's so amazing is that this was written by Hannah Senesh, not the melody, but the words were written by Hannah Senesh. This is her very first draft of it. And what's amazing is that Hannah was just learning Hebrew. Could you imagine? I mean, I can't write poetry in English. Could you imagine writing it in a second language that she just started learning a few years ago, really out of just ideological commitment. And this poem became, as I said, just one of the iconic songs of the Hebrew language, of the Jewish people, of the state of Israel. It was put to music in 1946 by a Israeli a musician, composer, David Zahavi, but we'll get to that. And what's also amazing, so at the bottom it says, it gives the date, you could see the date. It's November 24th, 1942, and the Hebrew says in Caesarea. And I don't know if any of you know, well, I'll just quickly, very quick, because it's short, I'll translate it. The name of it is A Walk to Caesarea. My God, it should never end. The sand and the sea, and this is an onomatopoeia, rishrush, the swish, the rustling of the water, the lightning of the heavens, and the prayer of man. And I don't know if any of you know Hebrew. There's a very big spelling mistake in this.
I'm going to turn just to Facebook for a second. Ella, I hope you're with us. And if not, I hope you. When Scotty and I decided on this topic, I was thinking of Ella. Because you all know that Ella spent time, Elohana spent time in Israel, and her Hebrew is very good. And so I wanted to see if she could catch this right away. So, Ella, if you're there, either now or in recording, can you find the spelling mistake? Does anybody here read Hebrew, this kind of writing? So, if you look on the, well, you go ahead, Scotty.
So the second line, Elisha lo yigamer la'olam, you see, it's la'olam is with an aleph. It should be with an ayin. You know, ayin and aleph, they're both silent. So it should be with an ayin, which means la'olam for forever. And I point out a spelling mistake, again, just to really just point out really how amazing this is that she could write this incredible poem that became so iconic in another language. But you could see that, again, it's a very glaring mistake, and it's still a second language to her, but still so amazing. And the song composer took a little liberty because, you know, it's Eli, Eli, you repeat it, but in the poem it's just Eli, my God once. But anyway, this is the original, her first draft of it. So being a museum person who knew who Chana Senesh was, you can imagine how excited I got when I had the opportunity to see it. It was clearly part of a notebook, because look in the upper left-hand corner, it says 17. And she wrote in notebooks that it's related to later in the story that her various people had her collection, and they were tearing it out. And eventually got back together again, but that's why there's a 17. It's not her 17th draft. It's on page 17 of a notebook. So we can go to the next slide. So Hannah, though she found solace in writing poetry, and that was just one example. She wrote dozens of poems. That's probably, I would say, her most famous, what I just showed you. Hannah still was just restless and wanted to contribute even more to the Zionist enterprise and the Jewish people. So she volunteered to be in the Haganah, which was the precursor of the IDF, of the Israel Defense Forces, and she volunteered or was drafted to be in a women's auxiliary air force of the British Army. Remember, the Yishuv Palestine was under a British mandate, and she volunteered to be in this women's air force with a very important mission to be sent to Europe, either in lands of Nazi occupation or lands that collaborated with the Nazis, and to parachute into these lands, one, to help local partisans who were fighting the Nazis, and also to help the local Jewish communities in duress. This was a joint project between the British Army, who were very interested in Hannah meeting with partisans, and the provisional government of Palestine, the Jewish government, who was interested in her meeting with the Jewish community. And this had to be a top secret. She took training in being a paratrooper, and also in becoming an expert in wireless radio transmission. So Hannah had a brother. Remember I said her father died, her mother was alone in Budapest, and her brother went to study in France and then got caught there as the Nazis invaded in 1940. He was able to get out in March of 1944 and came straight to Palestine. And this picture was taken the day after he got there. He's on the right, obviously on the right. His name is Giora Senesh. Giora and Hannah had one day together because the next day she was going on her mission. She didn't tell him about the mission. She just said she was going to Egypt for training, which she was, but he thought it was just to be in the Haggadah and to come back and to Palestine. But in fact, he had no idea she was going to Europe. They had this one day together, their first day, and it ended up being their last day together. And if you go to the next slide, David, that photograph that you just saw was, this is the back of that photograph. And presumably Hannah wrote on it, and I'll translate, Hinei ma tov u'mana'im shevet achim gam yachad, which I think many of you are familiar with, how good it is that brothers sit and dwell together. That's from the Psalms. And so she writes, Hinei ma tov u'mana'im shevet achim gam yachad, 1944, Tel Aviv. And she goes, Matov, how good it is. And she signs it Hannah, March 10th, 1944. So, again, this is beautiful, but it's also heartbreaking. Maybe, I don't know if she knew that she'd never come back. I'm giving away a little bit of them, but this is also such an incredible, just piece of history, and what a poignant thing, to write. They had this one day together in Tel Aviv. Her brother Giora has no idea where she's going. Obviously, she didn't tell her mother. And then the next slide. Yes.
Move over here, and that way the people sitting on the side might be easier for them to hear me. Look there and pick up this way.
Sorry.
I'm talking about more.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. So if we can go to the next slide. So, sorry. In the order. So this is a photo of, she was chosen, there were around 250 people who tried out for this mission. She and 36, there was total 36 other paratroopers were chosen. They were mostly men. There were only a few women. And this is a photo of them, I believe, on their way to Egypt, where they went for training. Then they went to Italy, where they continued their training. And then they were sent to various countries. They were sent to countries, where they would know the language. So Hannah, her mission was to infiltrate the community in Hungary. But she was actually parachuted into Yugoslavia to spend a few months with the partisans, Tito's partisans, to give backup in any way she could, either in fighting or maybe anything, being in the kitchen, paperwork, and also transmitting codes to the British about what was going on and who the partisans were fighting. Hannah did that for 3 months, and then she decided that the time came to cross the border into her native Hungary. And this was the part of the mission that she really wanted to do, was to warn the Hungarian Jewish community about what had what she believed was going to happen to them. Hungary, was the last Jewish community intact during the war. It wasn't invaded till 1944, the same time Hannah parachuted into Europe. And a lot of the Hungarian Jewish community did not really know, as unbelievable as it seems now, did not know the details of what was happening to the rest of European Jewry. And she just wanted to talk to people and just warn them and to try to encourage some type of resistance, something. So she crossed the border with 2 other partisans, male partisans, in June of 44. And they crossed the border. And Hannah had written a poem, and we can go to the next. slide. Hannah had written a poem while she was with the partisans. As they crossed the border, for some reason, I don't know if Hannah had a premonition she might get caught. She was a little more daring than the two partisans she was with, and she just gave this poem to one of the partisans she was with named Ruvain. His name was Ruvain Daphne, who survived and became, actually was the director of Yad Vashem for many years. She gave it to Ruvain and said, bring this back to the yeshuv, as if she knew that something was going to happen to her. Anyway, this poem, and I'm going to confess, and you could probably tell, this is actually just a photo. The original of this poem was lost over the years. Ruvain Daphne said he started to run and the poem went flying, and for some reason, he said, I just went back and picked it up. And he kept running with it, and he survived, brought it to Palestine, and it was sort of like, it was just given from person to person, and the original got lost. So this is like a photo of a photo of it. This is, this is her handwriting, but it's not the original. And at the bottom it says Seredica, which is in Slovakia, where she was before going into Hungary. This was written May 2nd, 1944. It's, I would say, perhaps her second most famous poem. It's called Ashreya Gafrur, which you may have heard of in English, is often translated as blessed is the match. But I wouldn't say blessed. I'd say Ashreya is more happy, content, profoundly happy. Osher. It's not blessed, it's content. But it's a fulfilled content. So I'm going to translate, but I'm going to substitute the word fulfilled for instead of blessed. Ashreya Gafrur, fulfilled is the match consumed in the kindling flame. Consumed is the flame that burns in the heart's secret places. Content is the heart with strength to stop its beating for honor's sake. I knew I couldn't see it. Consumed is the match consumed in the kindling flame. And people said that it's Hannah Senesh writing about herself. Content is the match that will, go up in flame. This, I would probably say, is her second most, as I said, famous poem. And there are all types of theories of where this poem ended up. So it's one of my missions. I want to find the original. Go around Israel and find the original of this poem. So you can go to the next slide. So, oh no, sorry, go back slide. I apologize. So Hannah got caught. She got caught almost right away, and by the Hungarians. She was brought to Hungarian prison in Budapest, and the Hungarian government now was they were collaborating with the Nazis. They were supporting the deportations, and in the jail, the Hungarians said, give us the code, the transmission codes. She had this radio with her, and they accused her of treason because she had been Hungarian. They considered her a Hungarian citizen, and they said, give us the codes, and she refused to give the codes. And they beat her. She had 2 black eyes, teeth missing, and she would not give the codes. And then they decided what they would do to force her to give the codes. They would bring her mother into the jail cell and said, we're going to kill your mother if you don't give the codes. And the police go to Mrs. Senesh's home in Budapest. Mrs. Senesh thinks her daughter is on a farm, on a kibbutz in Israel. And they said, Mrs. Senesh, where's your daughter now? And she said, she's in Palestine. And they go, well, where is she like now at this second? She goes, I don't know, but I imagine on the kibbutz. And they said, come with us. And they bring her into the jail, and she thought she's being arrested. They go into the jail cell, and all of a sudden, Hannah's mother sees Hannah there with 2 black eyes, no teeth, and they run and hug. Her mother's in total shock, and they said, Mrs. Senesh, and again, it's hard for me to imagine this. This is based on her mother, whose name is Katrina Senesh's testimony. They said, Mrs. Senesh, if your daughter doesn't tell us the transmission codes, we're going to murder her and you. And Hannah never gave the codes. And they did not murder They released her mother, and then they rearrested her mother. And Chana and her mother were so near and so far. For a few months, they were in the same jail in Budapest, but not in the same cell. Sometimes they would pass each other in the hall, but could not talk. And Chana was put on trial in late October 1944 for treason. Again, because she was considered Hungarian, and she had this transmitter that was helping the British, this radio transmitter that was helping the British. She was found guilty, and they said, if you beg for clemency, we won't shoot you, otherwise you're going to be executed. And again, we don't know what was going through Chana's mind. She refused to beg for clemency, and she was executed on November 7th, 1944, at the age of 23. And she asked, and her request was granted, that she not be blindfolded and face her killers. She just looked at her killers, and she was killed. A few days later, her mother was informed, and they brought her mother. They told the mother, that your daughter left you some things in the jail cell. You can come and get it. And there were two brief poems, or sort of letters. It's not on this slide. She found on the floor the following, or she found in Chana's pocket of her dress the following. It was a note to her mother that said, "My dear beloved mother, I have no words. All I can say to you is a million thanks. Forgive me if you can. You alone will understand why there is no need for words. With endless love, your daughter." And on the floor, on a piece of paper, was scribbled the following: "Life is a fleeting question mark, but death, I feel, is very near. I gambled on what mattered most. The dice were cast. I lost." And so a year later, Chana's mother moved to Palestine and was reunited with her son, Giora. And Chana's mother was instrumental in sort of spreading the word about Chana's mission and what she did. And within a year already in Palestine, Chana had a diary that was published, and she became really an icon and part of the Zionist pantheon really within a year or two, even before the state. The state was established in 48. By the time Israel was an independent state, Chana Senesh was known. The composer David Zahavi wrote this melody to Eli Eli that Rabbi Lazar sang for us. And over the years, I mean, there's not a town in Israel that doesn't have a Rehov Chana Senesh. There's a kibbutz called Yad Chana after Chana Senesh. And it's very interesting that she's such a household name in Israel. In the United States, people do know Chana Senesh. I'm talking about the Jewish community, but not like in Israel. And it's interesting, people talk about I don't know if the rift is the right word, but disagreements or differences between the diaspora and the Israeli community in terms of politics. But for me, what's so interesting is the difference in culture, how someone could be such an icon in one country and not in the other. I mean, Chana Senesh in Israel is like what Anne Frank is sort of in the rest of the world. And it's just, I don't want to overstate it. I knew who Chana Senesh was when I was young. I remember as a kid at Jewish summer camp, and there was a very well-known play about Chana Senesh written by the Israeli playwright Aaron Meged in the 1960s. So I remember seeing that as a kid and learning Hebrew as a kid. There was a series called the Gesher series of Easy Hebrew, and there was a story about Chana Senesh, which looking back, I'm sure was very sanitized. I was a young kid. That was me, but a lot of people, don't know this story. And her remains, Chana Senesh, was buried in a Jewish cemetery in Budapest. No one knows by who. There was just there was like a marker for her in a Jewish cemetery, and no one knows exactly the circumstances how that happened. Her remains were brought to Israel in 1950. There's very famous footage of it. She was buried in the area for Jewish parachutists in Mount Herzl Cemetery, which is next to Yad Vashem. And the next, thank you. So this is her grave. You can see the rocks on it, and it's Chana Senesh, the daughter of Katrina and Bella Senesh, who says parachuted on a mission for her people to the land of the enemy and failed, and fell, and like I said, falling in war. And it gives the date of Aleph Cheshvan in 1944. So that's the famous story, or that's the story of Chana Senesh. So getting back to 2000, in 2009, with this phone call from Eitan Senesh, her nephew, he calls me and says, I have my aunt's collection, her letters, and Chana Senesh's mother lived another 50 years more. She lived, I think, till 1998. She spent her life perpetuating her daughter's memory, but she lived with this pain for so long afterwards. He goes, he said, my mother went back to Stot Yam Chana's kibbutz and went to all her friends who had in boxes all that she had written there, her diary, her poems. We have everything. And can you help me find a home for it? Or maybe the Holocaust Museum would be interested. And, for a curator, that's like to get a call from the nephew of a Zionist icon like that. It says, help us with your collection. It was incredible. So, there were a lot of issues. What was the proper home for that collection? And I thought, and many people thought, it's really not at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. It really should be in the state of Israel. Albeit that most research or access to artifacts in this day and age are not in person, it's online, and things are digitized, and it doesn't really matter who digitizes it. Once it's digitized, but there's a certain sanctity to the actual stuff, the actual collection. So, after I retired from the Holocaust Museum in the very end of 2018, I spent a year making contacts with people, and I must say it was my idea that it should really be at the National Library of Israel. I couldn't decide between the National Library of Israel, which is, let's say, the equivalent to the Library of Congress in the United States, or Yad Vashem, which is the largest Holocaust museum in Israel. And it's really, as much as it's a Holocaust-related story, it's really an Israeli story. Her greatest legacy is really, it's her heroism, which was a great influence on Jewish soldiers in the IDF, and her literature and her poetry. To be sure, it is Holocaust-related, although, remember, Chana Senesh was not killed by the Germans, she was killed by the Hungarians, and not for being a Jew, but for being a traitor. It's not to say it's not Holocaust-related, but it's not a full Holocaust story. It's really, it's really Jewish, to be sure, but specifically Israeli cultural legacy. So her entire collection now, which doesn't just include papers and her poetry, it's everything. It's a lot of her poems she typed. It's her typewriter. It's her Bible from the Zionist youth movement. It's her camera. She was a talented photographer. Her entire collection, as far as we know, except for the Ashrei Gafur, Blessed is the Match poem, which was lost, but I'm going to find it one day, is at the National Library of Israel. It's already in the process of being digitized. And later this year, the National Library of Israel is opening a spectacular new campus to make their collections much larger than where it is now, to make their collections accessible. And I highly suggest the next time you're in Israel, if it's after the next few months, to go to the National Library of Israel to see the collection of Chana Senesh. So that's why Eitan Senesh called me many years ago. That's sort of the behind-the-scenes part of it. But it's really just the story of Chana. Just one of the... I would say in Israel, she's probably considered the greatest female Zionist icon. I would say in the United States, if you ask people who the greatest female Zionist icon, who is it? Golda Meir. And not to say that she's not, but I guarantee you ask in Israel. And anyway, so Eitan Senesh, the nephew, and his brother David Senesh, Eitan and David, they and their wives and their children both say till this day, when they give their name to somebody, someone asks what their name is and they say their name, they say, Senesh, you're related to Chana Senesh. A day doesn't go by. Even the younger generation, one of them, Omer Senesh, is just a kid. He's like 30 years old. He has a program on a Israel music station. So I say to him, Omer, you're young. Your colleagues are young. Do people still ask you, are you related to Chana Senesh when you say your name? He said, every single day. Every single day. Senesh is not a common name. So, Anyway, but for now, there's still many questions. Maybe you have some, and some we'll never know. And I try to get inside Khana Senesh's, head. Like, she didn't beg for clemency. Maybe she could have survived. And Eitan Senesh told me that picture of her and her brother together in Tel Aviv, Eitan's father died Hannah's brother died 15 years ago, but Eitan said, my father always said, if she told me, I would have talked her out of it. If she told me she was going back to Hungary, of all places, I would have talked her out of it. And that's why she didn't tell me. Not because it's a secret. She knew I would talk her out of it. So there's still a lot of questions. The collection won't answer every question, but it will give the world a sense of the treasure that Chana Senesh was and the Zionist icon. So I don't know if there's time for questions.